This photo here is a whopping 46 megabytes in size. But now, let's take a look at the same exact photo, but now saved as a JPEG. Wait a second. What just happened? How did that file magically shrink from 46 megabytes to 4.07 megabytes? In this guide, we'll break down exactly how that's possible and why it's not magic, but rather a combination of clever math, human psychology, and data tricks. And at the end, I'll show you the downsides of this and some next-gen alternatives, so stay tuned. All right, let's get started. First off, why do we need image compression in the first place? Well, raw images are simply massive. For example, a typical 12 megapixel photo taken in RGB mode will come out to around 36 megabytes. That's way too big to efficiently share over the web. Compression algorithms make them much smaller without ruining the photo. There are two main types of compression: lossless and lossy. Lossless formats like PNG and GIF do undiscard any information, so you could technically recover the original image. They're great for line art or anything where every pixel matters, but they still end up being larger than what we want. Lossy formats like JPEG and WebP, on the other hand, throw away some data to make smaller files. And since humans don't notice certain details, it ends up looking good enough, while saving tons of space. JPEG is one of the most common examples. Most photos on the web are saved as JPEGs because they tend to be very small while keeping details nice and crisp. Now that we know the basics, let's dive into how JPEG compression works step by step using one of these 8-bit color images. The goal is to take this 12 megapixel 46 megabyte photo and turn it into a JPEG under 5 megabytes. So here's how the algorithm actually works. Step 1. Convert to YCBCR. The first step is to convert the RGB image into something called luma and chroma. Y represents the brightness of an image, while CB and CR represent blue and red color differences from that brightness respectively. It turns out that human eyes are way more sensitive to changes in brightness than color. So we can reduce the resolution of the CB and CR channels without losing too much visual information. Because of this, many images have a lot of bright pixels and fewer color variations, making color downsampling a smart move to reduce file size. Step 2. Divide into 8x8 blocks. Now the image is split up into a grid of many 8x8 blocks. This is so that each block can be processed individually. That way we can skip the math for the rest of the image, until we need to add the blocks back together later. Step 3. Apply discrete cosine transform. Next, each 8x8 block goes through a process called discrete cosine transform, or DCT for short. The complicated math behind the scenes takes the pixel data and turns it into frequency components. Step 4. Quantization. The next step is called quantization. This is the part where the algorithm starts to permanently lose data. The goal is to further reduce the file size while keeping the image looking good. Remember earlier how the DC component was always 255 for an all-white block? Remember how it got smaller when the image had a darker, average tone? Well, if we divide the DCT components by a special quantization matrix and then round down to the nearest whole number, that DC component will always be rounded down to 0 regardless of the average tone of the block. In other words, if we increase the values in this quantization matrix, we'll start discarding more and more details. The reason why we multiply by a matrix instead of just using a single number is because different frequencies have different levels of detail. The low-frequency component has large values, so it needs a bigger denominator to bring it down to a reasonable size. Meanwhile, the high-frequency component has small values, so it needs a smaller denominator. A good example of this is text. Text has a lot of high-frequency components, because the edges of the letters have sharp changes in brightness. So the high-frequency components have big values. So if you crank up the quantization matrix, text will quickly become pixelated and hard to read. On the flip side, smooth gradients will not be affected as much because they have fewer high-frequency components. Now this is the key to why JPEG looks good enough. Even though we're throwing away lots of data, we're mostly getting rid of details that our eyes aren't great at picking up anyway. It's kind of like removing all the treble from a song. You can go way down before people start complaining. Step 5. Run length and Huffman encoding. The final step is to compress the DCT components even more, using a technique called run length and Huffman encoding. First, the algorithm scans the DCT components in a zigzag pattern and groups similar frequencies together. Then it replaces sequences of numbers with shorter codes using a table called a Huffman tree. This way, frequent patterns like horizontal lines have shorter codes, saving more space. So how exactly does JPEG achieve a 46 megabyte image shrinking down to 4.07 megabytes? Let's break down the factors involved. Factor original compressed color sampling for 242442220. Quantization strength none, high encoding, efficiency raw pixels Huffman plus RLE as you can see. The biggest savings come from going from 4 to 4 to 4 color sampling to 4 to 2 to 0. Basically, JPEG shrinks the color channels while keeping the full resolution of the brightness channel. That's it. We've now covered how JPEG compression works. Now let's discuss some of the downsides of JPEG compression. The first downside is that once you resave a JPEG, you start losing quality pretty quickly. That's because the quantization step is lossy. So each time you resave it, the algorithm discards more and more details. JPEG is also bad for anything with sharp edges like text. As we discussed earlier, the high-frequency components for text are very sensitive to quantization. So even a little bit of compression makes text harder to read. Finally, JPEG has a tendency to produce artifacts in high-contrast areas like jaggies on diagonal lines. These are caused by the blocky nature of the quantization step. There are modern alternatives to JPEG that might be better for certain situations. WebP is a format from Google that offers better compression than JPEG, while still being absolutely tiny. AVIF is another option that uses the newer AV1 video codec. AVIF can achieve smaller file sizes than JPEG and WebP, while also supporting HDR JPEG. XL is the next generation of JPEG being developed right now. Supports both lossless and lossy modes, and promises better compression than existing formats. So there you have it. JPEG compression is a balance between file size and quality. It gets rid of the extra detail our eyes aren't great at noticing, producing images that are small enough for the web without being completely ruined. Thanks for watching. If you learned something new, please consider liking and subscribing.